At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Sunday, September 26, 1985, five men emerged from a private meeting room on the 18th floor of the Plaza Hotel in New York City and stepped before a waiting press corps. The meeting had lasted approximately 3 hours. The communiqué they released was 11 paragraphs long. Its language was measured and diplomatic. The markets understood it immediately. The five men were the finance ministers and central bank governors of the world's five largest economies. From the United States, Treasury Secretary James Baker. From Japan, Finance Minister Noboru Takeshita. From West Germany, Finance Minister Gerhard Stoltenberg. From France, Finance Minister Pierre Barré-Govoy. From the United Kingdom, Chancellor of the Exchequer Nigel Lawson. Between them, they represented governments whose combined output accounted for the majority of the world's economic activity. What they had agreed to do was this: deliberately depreciate the United States dollar. Not by allowing market forces to work, by coordinating direct intervention in global currency markets, selling dollars and buying yen and Deutsche Marks, until the dollar's value fell to a level the United States found politically acceptable. From 1980 to early 1985, the dollar had appreciated by approximately 50% against the Japanese yen, the German Deutsche Mark, the French franc, and the British pound. The U.S. trade deficit had reached $122 billion, 3.5% of GDP. American manufacturers, facing foreign competition priced in currencies that were 50% cheaper, were lobbying Congress for protection. Congress was listening. Me Nikkei. The five men in the Plaza Hotel chose currency intervention over trade war. Within 2 years, the yen would double in value against the dollar, and the consequences for Japan would take a decade to fully emerge. To understand why five finance ministers gathered secretly in a Manhattan hotel on a Sunday afternoon to sink the world's reserve currency, you have to understand what the strong dollar had done to the American economy in the years before the Plaza. The dollar's strength in the early 1980s was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of two simultaneous policy choices in Washington. The first was Paul Volcker's interest rate shock, the decision to raise federal funds rates to 20% to break the back of 1970s inflation. High American interest rates attracted enormous capital inflows from global investors seeking better returns. That capital demand drove the dollar up. The second was Ronald Reagan's fiscal expansion, tax cuts combined with defense spending increases that produced large federal deficits. Foreign capital financing those deficits further supported dollar strength. Together, these two policies produced a dollar that by early 1985 had reached its highest valuation against the British pound since the Second World War. Against the Japanese yen, the dollar had appreciated from 211 yen in 1980 to a peak of 260 yen in February 1985. For American exporters, this was not a macroeconomic abstraction. It was a pricing catastrophe. A ton of American steel, priced in dollars, cost 50% more to a German buyer in 1985 than it had in 1980, even if the steel itself had not changed. A John Deere tractor cost 50% more in Japan than a comparable Kubota tractor made in Japan. American grain competed in global markets against subsidized European grain, now priced 50% cheaper in dollar terms. The industries most affected were not small: steel, automotive, agriculture, electronics. By 1985, a broad alliance of American manufacturers, farmers, and export-dependent service firms had organized a sustained campaign demanding relief. The Caterpillar Corporation, whose heavy equipment competed directly with Japanese manufacturers, was losing market share. Major agricultural producers testified before Congress that the strong dollar was destroying American farm exports more than any drought or blight could. Congress responded. By the spring of 1985, over 300 protectionist trade bills had been introduced in Congress. The threat was real. If the administration did not address the dollar's overvaluation through currency policy, Congress would address it through trade barriers. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. The 5 men who gathered at the Plaza Hotel on September 22 did not all want the same thing. Understanding why the accord held and why Japan ultimately suffered its consequences most severely requires understanding what each country brought to the table. James Baker's position was the most urgent. He had become Treasury Secretary in January 1985, replacing Donald Reagan, and had immediately recognized that the strong dollar policy of the early Reagan years was politically untenable. The protectionist legislation building in Congress was not a bluff. Baker needed a managed appreciation of the dollar that he could sell as a diplomatic triumph rather than a retreat. He needed his partners to agree to intervene, to sell dollars and buy their own currencies, so that the depreciation looked coordinated and orderly rather than like a market judgment against American fiscal policy. 1. The Germans under Gerhard Stoltenberg had their own concerns. The rising Deutsche Mark, while unwelcome for German exporters, was less alarming to Bonn than it was to Tokyo. West Germany's industrial base was diversified, its wage costs competitive even at stronger exchange rates, and its domestic market large enough to partially offset export pressures. The Germans were willing to participate, but Bundesbank President Karl Otto Pühl signaled within weeks of the accord that the dollar had already fallen far enough. Germany would not push the exchange rate beyond what its own exports could tolerate. France under Pierre Barré-Gauvois was strongly in favor of intervention. The French government had been pushing for coordinated currency action for years. The strong dollar had been damaging French industry and contributing to trade imbalances across Europe. But it was Japan's position that was most consequential and most paradoxical. Noboru Takeshita represented an economy that was the largest surplus country in its trade relationship with the United States. Japanese automobiles, electronics, and industrial goods were flooding American markets, not because of any currency manipulation, the Japanese argued, but because they were genuinely superior products at competitive prices. Takeshita knew that a sharp yen appreciation would damage Japanese exporters severely. He also understood that refusing to cooperate risked something worse: direct American protectionist legislation that could close the U.S. market entirely to Japanese goods. Bin. It was the less bad option. At the time, the communiqué was released publicly on the morning of Monday, September 23. By then, the central banks had already begun selling dollars. The mechanism by which 5 governments moved the world's most heavily traded currency is worth understanding precisely because it was not primarily a matter of raw financial firepower. Dollar traded approximately $150 billion per day in 1985. The total intervention committed by the G5 central banks in the weeks following the Plaza was on the order of $18 billion, a fraction of daily trading volume. Pure volume alone could never have moved the market by 40% over 2 years. What moved the market was the signal. Currency markets trade on expectations. When the 5 most powerful economic governments in the world announced jointly that they believe the dollar is overvalued and stand ready to intervene, every private participant in the currency market faces an immediate calculation. Do I want to hold dollars when the United States, Japan, Germany, France, and Britain are all selling them? The rational answer, in the hours after the communiqué, was no. Wildumstproisten. On Monday, September 23, the dollar fell 4% against major currencies in a single day. Traders who had been long dollars for years began closing those positions. The signal had worked before the central banks had spent $1 of their intervention commitment. The market had moved itself. Over the following weeks, the G5 central banks reinforced the signal with actual purchases. The United States sold approximately $1.9 billion against German marks and $1.4 billion against Japanese yen through the end of October 1985. The Bank of Japan intervened heavily throughout, but the critical observation from academic economists studying the episode is consistent. The expectations effect overwhelmed the mechanical intervention effect. By early 1987, the dollar had fallen approximately 40% from its 1985 peak. The yen had moved from 242 per dollar to approximately 150 per dollar. The adjustment the 5 men had sought was complete, and in Japan, it had already begun producing consequences that none of the 5 men had planned for. The yen appreciation hit Japan's export sector with an immediate and measurable force. Toyota, Honda, Nissan, their automobiles priced in yen were now 50% more expensive in dollar terms. Sony televisions, Panasonic electronics, Canon cameras, The products that had made Japan the world's most successful export economy in the 1970s and early 1980s were suddenly facing price disadvantages that no amount of manufacturing efficiency could entirely offset. The Japanese government and the Bank of Japan faced a choice. They could allow the yen appreciation to work through the economy naturally, accepting a slowdown in exports, a contraction in manufacturing employment, and a gradual reorientation toward domestic demand. This was the economically correct medicine, though it would have been painful. Instead, they chose stimulus. The Bank of Japan cut its official discount rate from 5% in January 1986 to 2.5% by February 1987, a level that had never been seen in post-war Japanese financial history. The government simultaneously launched large fiscal stimulus packages. The combined effect was to flood the Japanese economy with cheap money at precisely the moment when yen appreciation was compressing export profits and forcing manufacturing capital to seek returns elsewhere. Median, the immense Denshorasantering. Japanese real estate prices, which had been rising moderately throughout the early 1980s, accelerated sharply after 1985. By the late 1980s, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all of California. The Nikkei stock average, which had stood at approximately 12,000 in September 1985, rose to 38,915 by December 1989, an increase of 224% in 4 years. Japanese companies borrowed against inflated asset values to make acquisitions abroad. Mitsubishi Estate bought Rockefeller Center in 1989. Sony acquired Columbia Pictures. Japanese banks, sitting on assets that appeared to be worth 3 times their actual productive value, lent with what their regulators later described as catastrophic excess. The bubble was not caused by the Plaza Accord alone. The Bank of Japan's monetary response to the yen shock was a Japanese policy decision made by Japanese officials. But the Plaza Accord created the conditions that made that decision seem necessary and urgent. The 5 men in the hotel room handed Japan a problem. Japan solved it in the worst possible way. By late 1986, the 5 men who had gathered at the plaza had a new problem. The dollar had fallen further and faster than any of them had intended. The yen had appreciated so sharply that it was now threatening the coordinated response they had constructed. Japan was pressing for relief. Germany, whose export sector was also feeling the rising Deutsche Mark, was pushing back on further dollar sales. On February 26, 1987, the finance ministers of the G7 met at the Louvre Palace in Paris and concluded a second agreement, the Louvre Accord. Its purpose was the reverse of Plaza. If Plaza had said the dollar needed to fall, the Louvre said it had fallen far enough. The G7 established informal reference ranges, approximately 153 to 160 Japanese yen per dollar, 1.82 to 1.87 Deutsche Marks per dollar, and committed to defend those ranges through coordinated intervention. The Louvre Accord was only partially successful. The dollar continued declining against the yen through the late 1980s, reaching below 120 yen per dollar, far below the Louvre range, before eventually stabilizing. For Japan, the Louvre came too late. The yen appreciation had already driven the Bank of Japan to its 2.5% discount rate, and the cheap money was already flowing. The bubble had already begun inflating. The Nikkei's peak came on December 29, 1989, 38,915 points. Then the Bank of Japan, alarmed by the obvious excesses it had helped create, began raising rates. The discount rate that had stood at 2.5% in February 1987 climbed to 6% by August 1990. The Nikkei fell. The real estate market fell. The banks that had lent against inflated collateral discovered that collateral was worth a fraction of what they had carried it at. Non-performing loans accumulated on Japanese bank balance sheets. By the mid-1990s, Japan's banking system was effectively carrying a volume of bad debt that rivaled, in proportion to the economy, the worst banking crises in modern history. The lost decade, Japan's prolonged period of deflation, stagnation, and banking system dysfunction that stretched from the early 1990s into the 2000s, did not have a single cause, but it had a clear starting point. September 26, 1985, the Plaza Hotel. 11 paragraphs of careful diplomatic language, and 5 men who believed they could manage the global exchange rate without managing the consequences. The Plaza Accord achieved what it set out to achieve. The dollar fell. American export competitiveness improved. The threatened wave of congressional protectionist legislation did not materialize. By 1991, the U.S. current account balance had stabilized and briefly achieved a small surplus. The industrial coalition that had demanded action got partial relief. But the Plaza Accord left three legacies that its architects neither intended nor foresaw. The first was the demonstration that coordinated currency intervention can work, but only when it changes market expectations, not just market mechanics. The $18 billion spent by G5 central banks was not the instrument of dollar depreciation, the signal was. The paper that markets could see told them the direction of official policy. The lesson for every subsequent currency intervention is that credibility, not firepower, determines success. The second legacy was the Japan question, one that economic historians have not fully resolved. Did the Plaza Accord cause Japan's lost decade? The direct causal chain requires several steps. Plaza produced yen appreciation, which induced the Bank of Japan stimulus, which created the bubble, which burst and produced the lost decade. Each step involved Japanese decisions. The Bank of Japan chose to cut rates as sharply as it did. Japanese banks chose to lend as recklessly as they did. Japanese regulators chose to look away as long as they did. Japan's tragedy was authored by Japanese choices, but the constraints within which those choices were made were created in a New York hotel room in September 1985. The third legacy is the one that defines the modern international monetary system. The Plaza Hotel meeting of September 26, 1985, is recognized as the moment that created the G7 Finance Ministers Group, the institutional structure that has met regularly ever since to coordinate economic policy among the world's largest economies. Out of a secret 3-hour Sunday afternoon meeting at a Manhattan hotel emerged the architecture of global economic governance that has persisted for 4 decades. The Louvre Accord of 1987 produced a further institutional evolution, informal target ranges for exchange rates, and regular monitoring of macroeconomic indicators. The seed of international financial cooperation planted at the Plaza grew into the framework within which every subsequent global financial crisis, the Asian crisis of 1997, the 2008 global financial crisis, the COVID response of 2020, was coordinated. And yet the Plaza also demonstrated the fundamental limitation of that cooperation. 5 men in an afternoon can move exchange rates. They cannot control what happens after. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through, or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? What if? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.